Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 130. And this episode, Matt and I wanted to talk about a series that we've referenced a bunch that we are both very big fans of, despite not having played every single entry in it, which is probably for the best because it's The Legend of Zelda.
Yeah, although I will say, I think this is the one Nintendo franchise that I've played most of the games. I've definitely not beaten all of them because there are some DS and 3DS stinkers that I was like, nope, I'm good.
You haven't heard the good word of Triforce Heroes all by yourself?
I will admit that, like, the original multiplayer Zelda game, I forget which one it was.
Four Swords Adventures?
Four Swords Adventures, like, that was only fun because me and my friends spent most of the time fucking with each other and, like, lighting each other on fire and all of that
stuff. Are we
stuff.
diving immediately into Four Swords Adventures? Because I got some stories. I loved that game.
It was a very stupid multiplayer mod for a Zelda game, and it was fun, but also infuriating.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And it's the kind of thing of, you know, when we talk about good games, bad games, whatever else, it's like the memories that you make for them and the experiences that they are. I got Four Swords Adventures for the Gamecube because I was trying, I think I've told this story before, but here we are. I was trying to get a pre-order bonus for a different Zelda game. Like, it was like a Zelda t-shirt, and it was just like, I guess I'll get it if I buy Four Swords. And the GameStop employee's like, yeah. Like, okay, cool. And over the course of that summer, I bought 4 GBA link cables, and several of my friends bought used GBAs, whether SPs or handheld ones. And this is around the time that I had gotten the NES Classic colored Game Boy Advance SP, which is a thing that I still miss from my collection, and I will probably one day pay a stupid amount of money to get back. Same as probably Four Swords Adventures. At this point, it's gotten expensive, and I miss it from my collection. But yeah, that whole summer, us making our way through it, there were 3 of us that were typically always playing, and then the 4th slot would like rotate, or sometimes there would be nobody. So the purple link kind of just became we named him Neil, and someone had to be on Neil duty. Someone had to have the purple link following them around. And yes, we did also fuck with each other a great deal and took a great delight in that. But I also feel like the design in that was very cool because it made great use of the Game Boy Advance link cable, because playing that game, your controllers had to be a Game Boy Advance, because anytime one of your characters would go into a cave or underground or anything like that, rather than make everybody look at it, you would look at it on your Game Boy Advance screen. At the end of every level, you would get to vote on who was the most helpful, who was the most obstructive, and all these other things, and you would vote on your GBA. And in addition to having a little bit of secretiveness to that, a bit of subterfuge, it also kept the game going. You know, playing multiplayer dungeon crawlers and super fun until everybody levels up and you all have to share the TV screen to pick out your skill points. And I got this sword, and is it better than my sword? And that's just the first person. There's 4 of us. So, like, Four Swords Adventures, yeah, it's a big dumb romp, but they did some smart things.
Yeah, it was definitely a unique take on the Zelda formula. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we should talk about our entry to the series. I have a feeling that Geoff and I probably started around the same place. Funnily enough, the first Zelda game I ever played was actually not the original Legend of Zelda. I did play it shortly after, but I started with Zelda 2 because it's what my brother had, and I got a Nintendo after my brother did. And so I got some hand-me-down games, and that was one of them. He had Zelda 2. He might have had Zelda 1 too at some point, but like I didn't get that as a hand-me-down, and so I started with Zelda 2. And boy, when I tell you I hated that game, like a lot of people hated that game, very similar to our Castlevania conversation. But as an adult, I did learn to appreciate watching others play it, because it's an interesting take on Zelda, and it actually is pretty cool. It's pretty graphically amazing, the things they did in that in that second Zelda game. And so, like, I have an appreciation for it now, but every time I've gone back to play it, I'm just bad at it. I'm like, I don't want to play this game. But that was my first experience with Zelda. I didn't actually ever see the end of Zelda, the original Legend of Zelda, until a friend, Andrew, when we were all hanging out together at like a weekend just playing video games, he played the whole game straight through, and I got to see it. Those early Zelda games were really tough for me. I'd say the first Zelda game I actually really beat on my own was, of course, Link to the Past, which is to this day, one of my favorites. I'm curious where your Zelda adventure started. Did it start on the NES as well?
Oh, it absolutely did.
I had to imagine.
I mean, yeah, I'm the right age for it, as are you. And yes. Also, the NES was the system in my home on which I could play Zelda for the longest time. I mean, I grew up with an NES. We didn't get a 16-bit console. The next one that we had for a home console was the PS1, which, had, of course, all those Zelda games that... So a lot of the times when I'd be playing these things, it'd be at other people's houses or anything else outside of the NES titles. And I think the first one I played was the original. I certainly have stronger memories of that. Maybe I played Zelda 2 first, and I just bashed my head against it enough that I don't remember hating it, but I just remember being like, huh, okay. And the first one had so much discovery to it. And I think also because it was a game that my older brother and one of my older cousins were also very into, that I have stronger memories of that because while Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, has a lot of those sort of, what does this possibly mean? And here's some cryptic clues. And you need to piece these things together to find it. Zelda 1, the original, had a nice balance of, yeah, that's there, but so many big and small things can be solved and found. I remember very distinctly walking into whichever room it was where my brother and my cousin were playing the first Zelda and giggling their heads off because they had realized, whether someone had told them or pieced it together, whatever, that just about every screen in the original Legend of Zelda has a secret door on the overworld. You can burn a bush, you could bomb the wall, you can whatever. And a lot of them just have a moblin there who says it's a secret to everybody and gives you rupees. And
right.
I mean, I imagine that as a localization thing. I imagine it's a bit of like, don't tell anybody I'm here, here's some money.
Yeah.
But they found it so hilarious that it's like, oh yeah, it's a secret. There's secrets everywhere. What are these secrets? Like, I remember those sorts of things sticking out. I remember learning, very much the schoolyard kind of talk about how to get through the Lost Woods. Yeah. I remember accidentally figuring out how to climb Death Mountain because that actually is one you could accidentally figure out. It's just keep going up. Climb a mountain, kid. Or saving up enough rupees finally for the blue ring and being gobsmacked by the fact that it changed the color of my sprite, even on my save screen. Wow. It had so many cool things like that. And then there was the second quest. I don't remember when I first beat The Legend of Zelda, but I definitely did beat it in my childhood. I really spent a lot of time when I finally got a copy because I rented it a bunch before finally getting it. And I don't know if I own Zelda 2. I do now, but I don't remember if I did as a kid. But I definitely remember the first game really plugging away at that. And because it was the Zelda that I had, you know what? I'm going to admit this. I don't think I've ever finished A Link to the Past. I've played it. I've played a lot of it, but that's the one where I don't think I finished it, and I should. I shall.
Yes.
And I'd actually set for myself ages ago one of those, like, I'm going to beat every Zelda. I'm going to go sequentially, and I'm going to beat them all. So I have now since beaten the first and second one and a lot of the early handhelds. I stalled out around Link to the Past, but I should get back to that. And I agree with you. Zelda 2 is a game filled with a lot of actually incredible ideas and very forward-thinking design ideas, but poorly presented and held back by limitations of design philosophy of the time and just the hardware. And how many characters you could fit into an English text box.
For sure. It's funny, talking about Zelda, like, I don't think when I was a kid I was a Zelda fan. Like, I remember having both of the first two Zeldas, and I remember playing them a bunch, never beating them. In the Nintendo generation, I didn't beat a lot of games unless they worked with Game Genie and worked in a way that you could not die.
Fair enough, yeah. That's how I beat Super Mario Bros. 3 as a kid. I get it.
Yeah, and so, like, now I've beaten a bunch of those games on my own Steam, but it's taken, like, I've had to come back around to it. Link to the Past is definitely a game that I remember playing and beating, but I don't know sequentially where that was. It's definitely one of my favorite games, and I think I like it so much because it's where the straightforward narrative shines through the most for the first time, and also it's more forgiving than the first two Zelda games by a large margin.
Oh, definitely.
But I don't think I became a Zelda fan until the hype for Ocarina of Time, because like with other retrospectives we've talked about, the N64 was the first console I remember wanting like that I anticipated. The Nintendo I got as a gift way after it came out. Super Nintendo as well. I actually think I had a PlayStation and a Super Nintendo around the same time. So much later, like after Donkey Kong Country 1 was out, like much later into its life cycle. But an N64 I've told the story before in many places for my bar mitzvah. And like, I couldn't wait to have it. And like, I went home and played Mario 64 immediately. So when Ocarina of Time got announced, I got so excited. And I remember I got the gold cartridge. My friend Matt Karen bought it for me as a birthday gift, I believe. And so I got that and a t-shirt, and like it was the collector's edition, which was just a gold cartridge. It didn't come with anything fancy back then except the t-shirt, which is fine.
Yeah.
But that was when I remember anticipating a Zelda game, and I remember being absolutely blown away by Ocarina of Time. And Ocarina of Time is also one of the ones that I made my way through. Like, I just played it all the time. I was obsessed with it. I still have the strategy guide for it, which came with a song sheet for all of the Ocarina songs, and then a bottom stance where you could write in the one that you make up.
Oh, cool.
So it has me that scribbled in there for me. I think it came with the strategy guide also. That was like a collector's edition like bundle. But like, I still have that guide. It's falling apart. But like, that was the game that I dove into and memorized and played over and over again. And it's funny because as much as I loved that game, I was completely destroyed and disappointed by Majora's Mask, which is not by a bad game by any means, but it's just it does the Zelda 2 thing. It takes what we know and turns it on its head.
It's true.
And I think that's really interesting. That's been a pattern in a lot of the Zelda games. It's like you might get 2 in a similar style, but the second one will never be anything like the first.
Yeah, and I know that Majora's Mask, largely, that comes from the fact that they had to use a lot of the assets from the first game to make the second game. And so it's sort of a Mario Brothers situation, where rather than going, we're just going to give you what feels like a mission pack sequel or an expansion on the first game, how are we going to change this up if it looks the same? After Ocarina of Time was such a tour de force of cinematic presentation for the time, because it was. It's like, all right, well, we'll do something completely different. And so they did. And I very much agree with you that it feels like Zelda 2, and I think about it in a way that I don't imagine you're thinking of, because I am currently still playing through Majora's Mask slowly but surely with my spouse. It's one of those, we've both been pretty busy recently, and when we have time to game together, which is not a lot right now, but it'll come back, it's like, let's play Zelda. Playing through Majora's Mask, because of the 3-day time structure and the real time moving through and wanting to, and it largely being a side quest collection, because there's plenty of, so many Zelda games have side quests, but the way that they present this one, because you have to talk to this person at this time, move this thing along, make this happen, which has a living, breathing world idea on N64, which is wild, but is also, you need to know when all these things happen. Not everything carries over when you reset the calendar. Some things do, some things don't. You have to rebeat certain bosses in order to get conditions to further quests if you reset time. Other times, like, you keep all the masks that you have, but you need to rebeat the same guy to make spring come to the mountains in order to do anything after the snow melts. So we have our eyes glued to a walkthrough to make sure that we're not missing anything, because the anxiety about that is so real. And Zelda 2, I beat it because I had a strategy guide.
Right.
Because there are so many things in that of, where was I going to find that? How was I going to accidentally fall down that one hole in this graveyard?
Yeah.
And so there is a similar amount of, again, Majora's Mask, full of incredible ideas, wild stuff, great things. When we were talking about Infernax like ages ago, and taking the good ideas of some really uneven games, like it's that sort of thing. Like, people should draw influence from Majora's Mask, but it is rough to go back to without a guide. And I don't think that's great.
I think also the thing is about a lot of classic Zelda games is like they do require, like, I would say that most modern Zeldas you could get through without a strategy guide and experience the majority of the game.
Right. You may not get 100%, but you will get through.
But the older games, it's definitely much harder. I think also, like, I think back to the kinds of games that I like in the Zelda series, and I find that I like the top-down Zeldas better.
Same.
The 3D Zelda games have been great, but like I'll say it right here, and I've said it before, Breath of the Wild is not the best Zelda game ever made, in my opinion. However, it is one of the best 3D open world games for exploration that I've ever played.
Absolutely.
My biggest issue with Breath of the Wild is while it has some incredible scoring, it does focus a lot on scene setting, and the music is less in your face, I guess. Whereas classically in other Zelda games, like you hear the Zelda theme on the overworld, like it's meant to have like a ton of really, I don't want to say intrusive, but like bombastic and experienced music. And I just don't think Breath of the Wild does that. And like, we can't talk about Zelda without talking about Koji Kondo and all of the incredible music he's made over the years. But like, I think my favorite Zelda games take me back to the ones that have the most memorable music. Like, it's tough to pick a favorite Zelda game, but the swath of them are like Link to the Past, Link Between Worlds, the remake of Link's Awakening, which I played for the first time recently because I'd never played the original Link's Awakening, Minish Cap. These are all top-down Zelda experiences, and I really enjoy them. I like the 3D games too. Ocarina of Time is a favorite. You know, I really enjoyed Breath of the Wild, but like I never played Wind Waker because at the time, and I think I've talked about this before, I was like, oh, it looks like a cartoon. I'm a dumbass and I'm not going to play it.
You weren't alone in that.
Yeah, and now I don't have access to it, but hopefully that Wii U port is coming to the Switch. I'm holding out for that one.
Well, you don't still have a Wii U?
I never had one. So.
Oh, right. Yeah, no one did.
No. But like I never finished Twilight Princess, which I liked, but again didn't get through. Like Breath of the Wild was one of the first 3D Zeldas since Ocarina of Time that I saw through to the end. And like this came up when we were talking about Final Fantasy also. I think I'm a fan of the series and what it tries to do. I want to beat more of the games. I got the re-release of Skyward Sword on the Switch in hopes to eventually beat it, which I have yet to do, but I will go back to it. But like I think my biggest problem with the Zelda series is that every Zelda game has some kind of gimmick, and gimmick non-derogatory. Like it always a thing, a shtick. And if you vibe with it, you're going to love the game. If you don't vibe with it, it will ruin the experience. And like that's why like the 3DS games and the DS games I bounced off of so hard. I hated Phantom Hourglass and I hated Spirit Tracks because I did not like what they were trying to do. They weren't bad games, but I didn't vibe with their main mechanic. On the other hand, like Link Between Worlds was essentially a spiritual successor to Link to the Past, one of my favorites. And I loved its like wall clinging mechanic and turning 2D and all that stuff. So like, I think that's an interesting thing with the Zelda series that not a lot of action adventure or RPGs have, is like they always have a shtick, and if you don't like time travel, you're gonna hate Majora's Mask because that's all that game is.
That's all you do.
Yeah, and so like I think it's really interesting to think about Zelda in that way, and that the games that I've loved are the ones where the shtick is either ingrained in a mechanic that I enjoy or is just something that I don't bounce off of.
It is very interesting how the main series is both so iterative and repetitive, but also so very innovative at the same time, just about different things. It's part of, I feel, the Legend of Zelda's enduring legacy because by its design, by its nature, you are not the same Link every time, but you are Link every time. Yeah. And Link's design as a character from the outset was meant to be a little bit of a blank slate for the players to connect to. While that is not why Link was named that originally, it does work out very conveniently that he is the link between you and the world. Yeah. But again, each game, Link can be a little different, and your interpretation is probably a correct one. They keep him silent, and you can put yourself in there, which is super cool. And so, because it's one of those series that both has very deep canon and yet a little bit of a laissez-faire attitude towards its own canon and what's true and what's not true, because time travel, baby.
Yeah.
Ocarina of Time. Did you get a game over fighting the final boss? Great, you've created a timeline. And I love when games do that. I know that they don't build that into the original cartridge, but when they made Hyrule Historia and wrote out the timeline of Zelda, I freaking love that they did that. But you are able to have those kinds of things. And so in the same way that the Mario series allows you to sort of explore variations on a theme through characters that almost feel as though actors in a play, where they even imply that in some of the Mario titles. And it's why, Mario and Bowser can go go-karting together. Legend of Zelda has a little bit of that mythological feel. The story's told a little differently each time, and a little bit of a Castlevania feel of it's always Dracula, but why is Dracula back? Why is Ganondorf back? Is it the same Ganondorf? How does this Belmont, this Link, how does this hero of whom I am taking control, where do they fit into this, and who are they? They're always an underdog, and it's still the Legend of Zelda. It's Zelda's legend. You're just the adventurers. Who is connected to it, and how will you be connected to it this time? There's ways that it's like, yes, there will be triangles. There's a Triforce. There will be these players. There will be these things. But maybe they're the same. Maybe they're not. And I think that is a very cool thing. And yeah, you're right. It allows them to, while adhering to sort of like reified elements, then go, all right, this time we're on the ocean. This time we're just making maps. This time, time travel. I don't know. It is pretty cool that like from the outset you can be like, is this shtick going to work for you?
Yeah.
Figure it out.
Yeah. And I think that like it's why as a franchise it's stuck with me so much, even though I've only beaten a handful of them. I feel like I've gotten through more of these games than I have the Final Fantasy games. My completion rate for Final Fantasy is pretty pathetic at this rate.
That's fair.
Also, we're recording in July, and I've beaten one Final Fantasy game this year, even though I set out to beat a bunch of them. So, that's going well.
Hard
but but that said, like with the Zelda games, I mean, I think there are some that I think fondly of and want to revisit and have revisited, like, again, Link to the Past I've played multiple times. There are other games that I don't envision myself ever wanting to play again. It's funny, like I know so many people who love Breath of the Wild so much and have replayed it multiple times. I think that's great, but like I still haven't completed my original save file. I beat Ganon, but like I still haven't found all the Korok seeds. I definitely haven't found every shrine or temple. And so like I don't know. I feel like that game is done. Like, I don't feel a need to re-explore that world. I'm excited for the sequel for whenever it comes. It looks cool. It already looks like it has a shtick, and I'm always excited for that. I'm just curious if this is going to be another Majora's Mask situation for me, because often direct sequels with same assets I bounce off of. And it doesn't happen with every series, but it happens with some iterations. And this is, since the N64, the first time we're getting that kind of iteration again, where it's the same exact assets, the same exact graphical style, more or less, but a different gaming mechanic, and there's worlds in the sky. So, like, what's that going to be like? And so I'm leery about the sequel to Breath of the Wild only because, A, it's the first direct sequel we've had in a long time. Like, this is the same, as far as I know, the same Link, though they haven't confirmed that yet. So, like, I'm just curious how I'm going to feel about that game versus some of the other games that have done the same thing. We also don't know a ton about it yet. We've gotten some gameplay footage and some background info, but we don't actually know when this game takes place, if it's a prequel, if it's a sequel, if it's an alternate timeline. Like, we have no idea.
Yeah, we don't know if they're pulling an Age of Calamity and going, we're changing the timeline. Spoilers.
Yeah.
But I actually am a little more optimistic, if only because of the fact that, yes, Zelda games typically within a same console generation can run into that Majora's Mask Zelda 2 situation. But this is a situation as well where Breath of the Wild is a little bit like Twilight Princess in that they were launch titles for the systems that they are most known to be on because they were in development for the previous console and in fact have releases on the previous console. Have you ever seen Breath of the Wild on the Wii U? Because I have. No. It exists. It exists and actually plays pretty dang well. And it was a big deal that Breath of the Wild was the launch title for the Switch, and how interesting that the open world main console Zelda game was on the first console that was kind of open world. Yeah. The simpatico there is incredible. And I think of Twilight Princess, and I always giggle about the fact that they had to mirror flip it because, Link is famously a lefty. One of those things that just doesn't change. You can make Link a child, an adult, tall, short, a bard, a warrior, a ranger, a farmhand, whatever. He's a lefty.
Yep.
You put that sword in his right hand, and I swear to every goddess in Hyrule. Like, it's incredible. But because Twilight Princess was also launched for the Wii, where they had to presume righties for using motion control, they had to mirror flip the entire world. I love that. It's so stupid. I know why they did it. It's not actually stupid, but it's just stupid.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think ultimately, I mean, obviously I'm going to play Breath of the Wild 2 no matter what.
Same.
But I'm just cautiously optimistic, I think, at this point with that game. Also, I just want it to run well. You know, I loved Arceus on the Switch, but that open world game did not run well.
Mm-hmm.
When it was great, it was great. And I love it's become one of my all-time favorite Pokemon games, but it didn't run well. And Breath of the Wild more or less ran pretty smoothly. So I'm curious with them pushing the limits a little bit on the sequel, what that'll be like, but I guess we'll see. I think also we should take some time to talk about the handheld stuff, which we've talked about a little, and talk about the spinoffs. We could do a whole separate episode on the spinoffs, and we may sometime. Like, we're not really going to get into Hyrule Warriors, games that I've played and don't like because I don't like Musou games. They're just not for me.
Whereas for me, they actually got me to like Musou games.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But like, we have to at least mention, I feel like we're contractually obligated to mention the CDI games because they are infamous. So for those who don't know, the CDI was a CD-based system that was bad. And most of the games for it were bad. And it was one of the few times that, until very recently, Nintendo was like, we will license out this game. You can make games for your system. And they made 2 horrible Zelda games, The Wand of Gamelon and
The Faces of Evil.
And The Faces of Evil. And they are gloriously terrible.
Yeah. And why that happened is actually pretty fascinating. Because, yes, the Philips CDI was a product of the time when a bunch of companies were pushing CD media as the next big thing in entertainment and immersion. If you remember what Sega CD games were like or see anything about them, a lot of other companies were doing that too. And one's being like, we're technology people, we can get into video games. Sony was one of those companies. And the story of the soured Sony, Nintendo, Super Nintendo CD, PlayStation idea is fairly well documented and has had a lot of interesting wrinkles in its discoveries over the last actually year or so, with working prototypes coming out and everything else. And because Nintendo, I believe it was something if they didn't quite like the terms or there was some issues here and there, they also started a backdoor deal with Philips to develop their CD add-on instead. All these sorts of things happened, and that deal also fell through. But part of that deal, the fallout of that was Philips got to develop and publish a couple of... They also did Hotel Mario.
They did do Hotel Mario, which is also a very bad game.
It's incredible. These things are best seen as speedruns by more constitutionally hardy people and YouTube collections of the cutscenes because, you don't need to watch them a lot, but you should know what they're like. The world needs to remember so we don't repeat this history. Although, I believe it was Wand of Gamelon that is the first Zelda title that lets you play as Zelda.
Correct.
So that is its historical significance.
Yes. Also, like, as awful as the cutscenes are and stuff and the gameplay is, apparently there are some web-based emulated remasters of those games that actually play a lot better. So if you are curious, there are actually ways to play these games in a working order, and they are really interesting. There was also a third CDI game that was like a top-down Zelda game where you played as Zelda, but it used the Mortal Kombat style, like 3D graphics.
Oof.
It's awful. It's absolutely terrible. But I would have been remiss if we didn't actually talk about those at least a little bit. But I do want to cover stuff like, you know, Link's appearance in Mario Kart and Link's crossbow training and Tingle's Big Adventure and all of those kinds of things in another kind of like spin-off episode. But like, we're aware of those games. I think today's conversation is just mostly about the main franchise, since there are also a ridiculous amount of games in the main franchise.
Yes, there are. And as you mentioned at the top of the episode, it's one of those, like, this is a series that, man, I have played most of these. When we did our Kirby episode with Jacob, I had a moment of, I've played most Kirbys. No, I haven't.
There's so many.
There's so many. And Zelda both has a lot and not a lot, but actually a lot of games. And I've mostly played the top downs. If you look at my household of me and my spouse, we have played 95% of Zelda titles, whether we've completed them or not, also accepting the CDI games. But we've played 95% of the major Zelda titles. And there's been a lot of time and evolution and everything that's gone on with it. And certainly the NES to N64 era, there was a lot of games released.
Yeah.
I mean, the Oracle games for Game Boy Color, Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages, they are both forgotten and never forgotten It's kind of interesting because they're such an interesting anomaly of the games. They're absolutely fantastic top-down Zelda adventures. They were, I believe, developed by Capcom, which was also something of an interesting kind of, much like, the Philips development of those Zelda games. Oh, a non-Nintendo company's working on this stuff. That's not new anymore. But it was very odd to me as a child to see the Capcom logo pop up while I started up my Zelda game. And it was also built a little bit on the Pokemon idea of trading between games or working between games. And they were two different adventures that you could get passwords that you play the other one and you unlock things. A few years ago, I finally did the full Oracle playthrough. And let me tell you, it's worth it. It is so rewarding because having developed it that way, they could make one of them much more action-oriented and the other one much more puzzle-oriented. And one of them was, in fact, started out as basically a Game Boy remake of the original Zelda. And once you realize that, it becomes so obvious. You might not go, hey, wait a minute. But then you look at the bosses and then you look at some of the other things. You're like, ooh, yeah. And I guess that's one of the more obscure ones that I've played. I don't know.
I mean, it's interesting. Like I mentioned earlier that they don't really do a ton of third-party development, but that's not true. A lot of the handheld games, like my favorite Zelda game, or one of my favorite Zelda games, not quite ready to make the commitment broadly yet, but like one of my favorites is the Minish Cap on Game Boy Advance, which was also developed by Capcom. And like, I think of that as a core top-down Zelda game that's true to its predecessors in its style, but also does its own thing. It's one of the few Zelda games where you're not fighting Ganon. Ganon's not a boss at all in it. You're fighting this wizard.
Was that a Vati title?
I think that was a Vati title. I'm having trouble remembering, but like it's one of those things where you actually get to play a different kind of Zelda story. And I think some of those are the strongest ones. Yeah, this is a Vati game.
Okay.
He's the main villain. I think at the end, he like gets possessed by the spirit of Ganon or something.
All right,
that
whatever.
might have been this game. I don't remember. But like, it's just really interesting. I forgot how closely knit Capcom and Nintendo were back then making Zelda games because they did a bunch of them. Because I believe also one of the, I think Four Swords was also like co-developed with Capcom maybe.
Might have been.
I don't remember. But like, it's really interesting that for the most part, Zelda games follow a certain formula. But even when third-party developers get involved, they do their own take on what already exists. I think one of the reasons the CDI games were really terrible, besides just not playing well, is they were so different. And they modeled themselves after Zelda 2, which, not renowned and loved by the fan base.
To paraphrase Tropic Thunder, never go full Zelda 2.
No. But like, I think it's really fascinating when the third-party developers get involved and how that stuff plays out. I mean, Grizo worked on Triforce Heroes, which I was thinking of, which are also a third-party developer. It's interesting that third parties have had their hand in Nintendo stuff Zelda stuff more than I had originally thought.
But it's largely the handheld stuff.
It's largely the handheld stuff. Even like famously, Grizo, I believe, led the remake of Link's Awakening on the Switch as well. And like, that's the first time I ever played Link's Awakening. And it's incredible. It's an incredible version of Link's Awakening. And if you haven't played it, I highly recommend it. Yeah, Grizo developed it. They didn't even co-develop it. They developed that remake. And so like, it has this claymation style. It really pops off the page. Like, I think it's really interesting that Nintendo with Zelda has been more willing to experiment and let, Grizo did a bunch of the 3D remakes also on the 3DS, like letting other people touch their franchises and working with other people instead of just keeping everything in-house. I think some of the most successful games in the Mario franchise are when they were developed or co-developed by other people. I mean, rest in peace, Alpha Dream, but like I love those Mario and Luigi games.
Absolutely.
And like, it's like when we were talking about Metroid, like the fact that Metroid isn't in-house anymore. It's Retro Studios or it's Mercury Steam. And like both of those companies have done such great job with those franchises. We could see a lot more of Nintendo being more willing to take risks with other companies. I think that's a good thing. I think I want, we talk about this a lot. I want, in just our last episode of the Godzilla episode we talked about how we want these different styles and different companies making these different games. Like imagine a strategy turn-based RPG with Zelda units and with Zelda characters. I mean, we've gotten some Musou games, which were incredible, which are also developed by a third party. Like, I think as much as I love Nintendo just doing Nintendo stuff, in this generation and last generation, we've seen so much more experimentation with third parties. And I hope we continue to get that in this franchise, because I really like that we have been.
Yeah, because these franchises some of them have been around for a very long time. As of the date of us recording this episode, the Famicom turned 39 very recently. And while Mario, Zelda, a lot of them didn't come out immediately, they are still over 30 years old. And they've had a lot of iterations. And as I mentioned before, Zelda has a certain mythological quality that I almost liken to comic books, where some of the longest running characters, it is impossible to get a consistent characterization, even if it is the same Batman the entire time. And DC is in charge of it, but you let other people take a stab at it. And I think those fresh ideas and people who grew up with these games, I mean, Eiji Aonuma, the current head, I suppose, of Zelda, the lead, he started with Ocarina of Time. It's a sense of like, who's the real parent of these things and are they still in charge? Who cares? A little bit you care, but those fresh ideas can, add a lot to that. And I think Zelda has had that for a while, even before they brought in third-party developers, because of the handheld titles. The very first handheld Zelda title was Link's Awakening, which was a companion piece sequel to Link to the Past that did not take itself too seriously. It was meant to be Zelda as a fever dream.
Right.
You had Chain Chomps or Bow Wows from Mario. Kirby showed up as this very weird kind of enemy in the dungeon that wasn't called Kirby. You could win a Yoshi doll. All of these like weird little like crossovers and things that they don't sit there and go, oh, look at that reference. Or like, oh, that's weird that that's here. It's just there. And it creates this sort of like, well, this is all just a little slapdash and wild. And that allowed for the way that those games played and the future games as they were developed with additional outside studios working on them. There was a certain amount of, yes, this is Zelda. And yes, this has that mythological quality. And yes, these are epic adventures. But also, here's a kangaroo with boxing gloves. He's your buddy. Great! Video games are weird. I love video games, and I love when they do this. And so I haven't played the remake of Link's Awakening on the Switch. I played so much Link's Awakening and Link's Awakening DX on the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. I will eventually get around to it, but I did not have the drive of, at last I can have this adventure. I actually, last year, re-beat Link's Awakening DX. That is one that I go back to fairly regularly. It's very satisfying.
As I understand it from people who've played both, that this is a version that is definitely worth playing.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, for one, you have all the buttons you need to use your stuff instead of constantly switching all the time.
We had 2 buttons. It was the first game you could unequip your sword because you needed to put bombs on the arrows you were firing, and we did it, and we loved it. Why do you need more face buttons to make anything happen? You're doing anything with stuff besides the shovel?
Yeah, there's a dedicated sword button in the remake because you have enough face buttons. But yeah, I mean, I think that for me, the handheld games will always be my favorite, which is why the Switch is so interesting. Because to me, the Switch is a handheld system. I barely ever play it docked. It also, I have the OLED, so it looks better in handheld. But, I think it's why I liked Link's Awakening remake so much is because I liked Breath of the Wild. It is a great game and a good Zelda game, as far as I'm concerned. Come at me, I guess. But, Link's Awakening is what I wanted. I like top-down Zelda games. They are my favorite kind of Zelda game. That's not going to change just because they make a really great 3D one, as much as I love the 3D Zelda games. And so it's just my preference and why I avoided the first-person Metroid games, which I will eventually play when I can get my damn hands on them, is I like side-scrolling games. And so that was my preference. But, I think that Link's Awakening took what we've learned over the years in making these top-down games and just made it a more immersive experience. Plus, it's just cute as heck. It just looks good. And
it looks adorable.
And so that's a big part of I also like pixel art. I like cartoony art. Again, I know I missed out on Wind Waker because I was a stubborn bastard, but I think that at the end of the day, I don't mind that Breath of the Wild is realistic and really intense, and I like the item and weapon degradation. If you don't, you're missing the point of that game. But that's a different story. But there are certain Zelda games that I have no desire to revisit because I got my experience from it. And I just don't look on it fondly enough to revisit it. I like Zelda 1 and 2. I've beaten 1. I've watched someone beat 2, so I consider that to count. I will never probably play those games again except to mess around. I just have no interest. Just like the original Metroid, which is a fine game. But why would I play the original Metroid when I have Metroid Zero Mission, which is that game, but better? It just improved in every way. And people like the older versions of stuff, and that's totally legit. But I think for me, I need some of the modernization for me to be able to do it. I'm just not a elite capital G gamer. And so I struggle with those older games in a way that the newer games are a lot more fun. And Zelda Breath of the Wild was great, but it was punishing at times because it was designed to be that way. It was never impossible, but I kind of I like the challenge of a top-down 2D Zelda better. And I think as graphics and innovation gets better, those games will just grow. And I hope now that we have a Nintendo console that is permanently portable, that we will still continue to get this alternation that we got with the Switch, where we get a 3D and then we get a 2D, and then we get a 3D and then we get a 2D, because those used to be designated to separate consoles, but now we don't have those separate consoles anymore, because as much as I love the 3DS, it's just about dead at this point.
Unfortunately.
And so I'm hoping that as we eventually are going to get a Switch 2 in some shape or form, whenever, that we continue to see this altering between 2D and 3D Zelda games, because I think both of them have their place in the history of the franchise, and that people like to say one is better than the other, but I don't agree with that. I think they're hitting different notes, and that it's okay to have a preference, but I think they're both valid and interesting. And honestly, I want to see Zelda get even weirder and do more unique things.
Absolutely. And I feel like the 3D Zeldas moved a little more in the puzzle solving thing. And I think that's Ainuma's influence as well.
Yeah.
Like the puzzle box idea. Whereas the top-down games, there are puzzles and there is everything else, but they're always a little bit action. And they are almost what I would call, because I was thinking about this, the genre of The Legend of Zelda is not quite as bad as What is the Sandwich discourse, but it does have its things. And I would call it dungeon crawling Metroidvanias.
Yes.
Because Link to the Past is a noted influence in the development of Castlevania Symphony of the Night.
Yes.
And when you look at the idea of how do I get past things in this dungeon, you need to find the item, and this helps you get through that. At its most basic form, there's variations on that. And the original Legend of Zelda on the NES, there are dungeons you can't complete, places you can't get to, secrets you can't do, that you need items from completely different areas or abilities from completely different spots or connect these things, and you open up that closed open world, which goes all the way back to our Metroidvania episode, and that's sort of how I think of Metroidvania games. They are closed open worlds. So that's where you get with Zelda. And it's also interesting that, as Zelda is such a venerable series, there's something interesting that I say. There are two major influence tracks, if I want to call it that. One is the trappings of Zelda itself. Mm-hmm. As I mentioned before, in contrast to you, Matt, I enjoyed Hyrule Warriors, and it got me to like Musou games. And I think some of that was, Dynasty Warriors was fun, and I'd goof around with it with my friends, and it just seemed like a lot of mindless insanity and fun, but not quite. Hyrule Warriors gave me just enough lore and just enough things to connect to, and it altered the gameplay just a little bit. But there was enough to it that I was like, oh man, yeah, absolutely. I don't think I can get Sarah to play Crypt of the Necrodancer, but we're definitely going to play Cadence of Hyrule at some point.
Right.
Because that's, again, utilizing Koji Kondo's incredible compositions for the Zelda series through wacky rhythm game dungeon crawling and roguelikes. On the other side, there are a lot of 3D games that have bits and pieces of what feel like 3D Zelda-like qualities. Ico and Shadow of the Colossus have that kind of a feeling. Mm-hmm. And I've heard Darksiders described as goth Zelda.
Yes.
But also, stuff like Binding of Isaac is absolutely a top-down Zelda game. And there's so many others that I am just utterly blanking on. Even back in the NES days, a top-down action game or a top-down dungeon crawly adventure game was a Zelda-like. One of my favorite NES games, Crystalis, it's a Zelda.
Yeah.
It's a damn good one, but it is. And in the same way that last episode we were talking about how tricky it can be to get different Godzilla kind of games, but people make big kaiju games. But do they feel or do they quite capture? Because Legend of Zelda starts as a game franchise, you can have that kind of gameplay influence and put it to the trappings of the studio that makes it. And we will still, even if Nintendo never makes another top-down Legend of Zelda game, which I would personally see as a great tragedy and a sad event, but even if they never did, we are still going to get great Zelda-like titles in that style. And I'm always excited for when those come out. And I love how you can kind of branch off those influences because, again, that sort of vague but distinct mythological status. I keep coming back to that, but that's really what The Legend of Zelda feels like to me. And not just because of goddesses and triforces, but because of the nature of its releases, its iterative and innovative nature.
Yeah, I mean, and I think its influence I wear more on my sleeve than I thought. And a great example of that is one of the games I did for side quests and one of my favorite games of last year, Eastward, is a Zelda game. And it's a top-down Zelda game. And what's funny is like I had a lot of conversations with a friend of mine, Eric Van Allen, who is an incredible writer over at Destructoid, who also liked it but didn't love it as much as I did. And we couldn't really figure out why. But we've also had conversations and he loves Zelda Breath of the Wild and thinks it's one of the best Zelda games. And so I'm making an assumption here. Eric, if you're listening, please feel free to correct me. But I think...
Call us out.
But I think the reason we diverged is because I love top-down 2D Zelda games. They're some of my favorite games of all time. And Eric seemed to prefer the 3D Zelda games, which is totally fine. And why he thought that the combat was a little weak and the puzzles were weak and the story wasn't that great. Or the story wasn't perfect, like it meanders. And all of that was valid criticism. It's not a perfect game. But I kept saying it was a perfect game for me because it's like, here's a Zelda game without Zelda. Enjoy. And if more indie developers did that, I wouldn't complain. And so like, I think these games, even if I don't always beat them or I don't always play every one of them, though I've played most of them, their influence is ingrained in me. In the same way that like platformers like Mario shaped our love of future things like Shovel Knight and the like. And so I think that ultimately, because I prefer 2D Zelda games, that's always going to be the preference. But again, if the 3D Zelda game is really good, I will stick with it. I will enjoy it. And I think what I love about the diversity of this series is we never know what we're going to get next. We still have a ton of questions about Breath of the Wild too, and I'm always eager to see what this franchise does. And I will always buy their games day one because I love the franchise so much.
Yeah, and I'm always happy to go back and find the titles that I missed. I mean, as I said, it was a while before I had another console that could play a Zelda game. As far as that goes, I went from NES to GameCube in terms of when I could do it again. So it is always a history lesson for me, and I relish it. And I find it very interesting that, 2D top-down Zelda games are my jam. And I do enjoy Breath of the Wild. I don't know if it's my favorite game ever, it's the greatest, I like it. Yeah. It's good. It's really freaking good. Some of that is... For me, I think the 3D movement in Zelda needed to reach a certain point. Skyward Sword does okay, like those kinds of games do all right. But I'm playing through Majora's Mask right now with Sarah, and there's a little bit of, even just because she's holding the controller 95% of the time, this is fine, this is how we play these sorts of games. And I am still getting a lot of enjoyment out of it. Just saying that. However, even watching her, who grew up with the N64, who played 3D collectathons and unironically loves them and shut up, I love them kind of thing.
Yeah.
Watching her struggle with the controls, watching her struggle with navigating in that world, whereas the top-down games, I don't have that struggle.
Yeah.
If I run into a situation that gets out of hand, I know where I screwed up. And that's me. And that's speaking to my experience. And I feel you have a similar kind of situation there, Matt. And why, again, if they make more top-down dungeon crawly action adventure titles, it's not like you're ripping off Zelda. It's great. More of this. I love it.
Yeah, 100%. Well, before we wrap up, I guess we should buckle down and actually pick a favorite. It's funny, all of my favorites are based on memory because I haven't replayed them recently. But the tops of my list are Link Between Worlds, which was a spiritual successor to Link to the Past, and Minish Cap, both, as I recall, being my favorite Zelda games of all time. It's funny. The conversation is always what's the better Zelda game? Ocarina of Time or Link to the Past? Those are the two that people always pit against each other. And it's for me, they're great games that define generations, but I don't think they're anywhere near the best Zelda games anymore because we've had so many innovations since then.
Yeah, the bigger argument would be which is a more important game, historically speaking.
Right. But I think for me, I'm going to buckle down and rely on muscle memory, and I'm going to replay it soon, but I'm going to say the Minish Cap, which was developed by Capcom. But I really love that game. I think it's interesting because the story is not just about Ganon It's the character, I think it's Ezio, the hat that talks to you is charming. The Minish world is charming. Like, it's such a different take on Zelda, and I really love it. But if I had to pick like a Zelda, Nintendo developed Zelda game, it would be Link Between Worlds, because Link to the Past was my favorite Zelda game for a long time. And Link Between Worlds was just more of that with better graphics and sound design, but it functionally played identically to that game. And so like, I can't just pick one. Those are like my top 2 Zelda games of all time.
That's fair. I mean, I've just started playing the Minish Cap. It's kind of in my like weird handheld rotation right now. Mm-hmm. Sarah played it about a year or 2 ago and came out of it raving about how incredible this game is. And she's played a lot of Zelda. And so that is a ringing endorsement in addition to yours.
Right.
Like I do take your endorsement very seriously, but also you did not see Sarah going nuts about this game. Please understand. And so I've started playing it and I'm already seeing what a great game it is. It's too early for me to be like, oh, it's going to be my favorite or whatever else, but it's great. I think mine are the Oracle games. Mm-hmm. There's something about playing through those top-down Zelda games that I love. Some of the later games. I love where the series has come, where it's going, everything else. But that same thing, like there's some memory and there's a little bit of, I don't want to call it like a platonic ideal of a certain game or of a type of game. But I mean, Link's Awakening and the Oracle games are games that I absolutely, sometimes you just play a game or replay a game and you're like, oh God, I just really am loving this. Like you take a moment outside of yourself and revel in it. Mm-hmm. And that's what those games were and are for me. Even in frustrating points of like, how do I solve this? What the hell is going on? It's never too challenging that I feel like I have to look something up. Once or twice I have, but that feels par for course on games where you have to solve what's going on. And it is a very interesting thing where, Legend of Zelda for the NES, most of what I learned from other people. Mm-hmm. Whereas nowadays, it's like you got to look up walkthroughs. You got there's so much complication. I don't know what conclusion to draw from that, but it is an evolution of how socialization in game releases has evolved over time, as well as technology to provide the information. But the Oracle games, I reveled in experimenting with past and present, with the different seasons, depending upon the title, how they affected each other and what it was. And it can get a little clunky sometimes being like, okay, I need it to be autumn now. It's winter. Change. Okay, now I need to... There is a little bit of that. Yes, I joked before, but having extra buttons for that would be great. But I still love that style of adventure, that style of exploration, and that certain amount of serious but irreverent that other Zelda titles have great things. I love the trappings of Zelda. Mm-hmm. I often feel like it's one of my favorite series in general, even if there's no one game in particular where I go, that's my favorite, or they're in my top 5. I love what the series is.
Yeah.
And what they do and what they try. And I know that feels so vague, but I guess if I had to pick a favorite, it would be Oracle of Seasons, Oracle of Ages. Probably Ages if I had to pick over Seasons. That's just more due to nostalgia, because that was the one I had growing up until I finally got Seasons.
Yeah.
And if I had to pick entirely in-house, Link's Awakening, because cop out.
Yeah.
But it's also a really, really good game.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the irreverence, and I think the reason I love Minish Cap so much is it has that humor, it has that irreverence that the Oracle games have.
Yeah. Ezio is voiced by Danny DeVito in my head.
Yes, absolutely, 100%. But, I mean, I do want to say, Nintendo, if you're listening, and I know you are, you listen to every episode of our podcast, you just did do a Link's Awakening remake. It sold like gangbusters. The Oracle of Seasons, you love doing your packaged together Pokemon 2-packs. You're doing it for the upcoming games this fall. Just saying, a remake of Oracle Ages and Seasons, a 2-pack, you're going to make a lot of money, make a lot of people really happy.
And I mean, maybe you can finally revisit that idea of the third game. It was meant to be a Triforce kind of thing, and there was going to be a green one. They had the third Oracle in there. I think she was the Oracle of Secrets. Mm-hmm. They were each based on a different of the 3 goddesses. Like, you could really do something there that, I mean, it'd be a lot of effort. I know that. Like, the third game was canceled because the password system between them was ridiculous. But, if you do it as all one big thing, it doesn't need to have the passwords, but there can be save file crossover. And that would be a little less complicated. Who knows?
You can take that idea.
I just got myself excited talking about this. I want this now.
Yeah, we gave you that idea for free. We just put us in the credits. That's it. Just Fun and Games podcast. It'll be fine.
Totally. Thanks for listening, Nintendo.
But yeah, I mean, I think we could probably go another hour about the Zelda franchise, and I think there's so much to talk about. So many different experiences. I mean, I'm sure we didn't talk at length about half the games. I'm sure someone listening, we didn't even mention their favorite Zelda game. So, like...
And why do you like Link's crossbow training so much? Why?
Why would anyone want to play with a crossbow? For a lot of reasons.
I mean, it's a lot of fun.
Yes.
I got it for like $4 a year and a half ago, and I immediately got my money's worth and beyond. Immediately.
But please tell us what are your favorite Zelda games. Tell us why you like, if you prefer 2D over 3D. If it doesn't matter, tell us why you love this franchise or don't love this franchise. If you've never played a Zelda game or you don't like Zelda, let us know why. I mean, these games aren't for everyone. I know plenty of folks who are not a fan of the franchise. So just shower us with your responses, as we love to hear them.
Let us know what are your favorite games that are clearly influenced by Zelda. One of my favorite old articles to go back to every now and then is called I Can't Believe It's Not Zelda. That I think was a Destructoid article that is recommendations of, if you like this Zelda, try these games. And I think it's a fantastic thing about the series. What's your favorite Zelda whose influence goes to other games? Like, what game do you like to play that goes, it's exactly like this Zelda? Awkward question, but please tell me anyway.
Yeah.
And I know we are inevitably going to have another hour talking about this because Breath of the Wild 2 is coming out.
Yes.
And we want to hear from all of you about which of those games we should talk about and what you think about these games because, yeah, its influence is great. And we want to hear about all of that. And there's so many ways to reach out to us about it. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at funandgamespod. You can email us at funandgamespod@gmail.com. We love hearing your responses to whenever we put up a question of the day. We love hearing what you think of past episodes, what you want to hear in future episodes, what guests we should have on here, and how we can evolve on this show. And you can also let us know on our Discord server. If you go to certainpov.com, you can check out not only past episodes of this show, of side quests, of other fantastic nerdy podcasts on the Certain POV network. You can also find a permanent invite link to our Discord server.
You can also rate and review us on your podcast platform of choice. It really does help us to get featured so more folks can find the podcast. If you're thinking right now, I'll review it eventually, like they keep asking, do it now. It really helps us. We really appreciate it. Please do. Also, if you want to buy some merch, we do have some Fun and Games merch on the Certain POV Teespring. You can also find that through certainpov.com.
If there's anything really funny that we've said that you want on a t-shirt, let us know. We'll make more merch. I want more merch. These things are great. And also, through all of this, as silent as Link is, we want you to be the opposite, just as vocal, because this is a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.
I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon. And I'm the host of CPOV Autographs at certainpov.com. It is a bi-weekly interview series where I interview folks from all over the arts, from writers to comedians to magicians to musicians, even actors, historians, podcasters, pretty much anyone who's willing to chat with me for a little bit. If you like interesting conversations with even more interesting people, go to certainpov.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, music is life and life is good.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.